If you could pick one metric to be your North Star as a marketer, what would it be? My guest today, the answer is simple.
I am a champion of NPS because, Max, it measures advocacy. How likely are you to recommend? And that to me is the gold standard in terms of what you want to achieve with a client or, for that matter, a colleague.
Hannah Grove was CMO at $4 trillion asset manager State Street. She humanized the brand through a customer-centric philosophy and creative collaborations. The partnership with TED Talks is still one of the most successful organic campaigns for any finance brand.
We had more than 3.5 million views of TED Talks by State Street colleagues. There was one talk about stage fright, which actually was a colleague of mine in the marketing team whose talk got more views than Bono at U2.
This episode is a masterclass in financial services marketing from someone voted as one of the most powerful women in banking. You're going to learn how Hannah transformed State Street as a marketeer, why NPS should be a CMO's #1 metric, and why it's so hard to create great content in-house. All that and more coming up with Hannah. Hi, Hannah. How are you?
I'm great, Max. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here. I'm actually delighted that we managed to get this interview together today. You've been an amazing sounding board for me personally over the last couple of years and Finimize. So I'm hoping that we can share some of that value and those insights with our audience today.
Thank you so much. It's a real delight to be here.
What I would like to start with is the role of the CMO just continues to change. So I'd like to hear from you, a CMO, what you think the role of the CMO is today, and what are the things that separate an exceptional CMO from a good one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great sort of opening question, Max. And for me, I would boil it down to 4 sort of very sort of simple or seemingly simple things. I think number 1, the CMO has to be the voice of the client in the organization. And in order to be the voice, they have to be listening to and understanding and act as a conduit of client data. The second piece that I think is important for the CMO is to truly understand the business and the business context. I think very often, we're creative people. We like to explore different media, different approaches. But ultimately, to me, the true success of a CMO is in how effectively he or she can sort of articulate the business context. The third piece, I think, is to being able to develop and nurture really great talent. I mean, honestly, Max, if I had any success as a CMO, it's because I hired people that were better than me and continually
You're
learned.
very humble. That's one of your traits as a CMO.
No, but it's true. I mean, I really feel that responsibility to build marketing organizations for the future. And then the fourth piece is to be really focused on metrics and making sure those metrics dovetail with the overall KPIs for the company, as opposed to kind of typical marketing metrics that I think can be sometimes too difficult to quantify. So those are my 4 things that I certainly, guided my career, and I think are hallmarks of successful CMOs.
And it seems that, I've now been doing this for, say, 6 weeks. I've spoken to some incredible CMOs, and it seems like more and more emphasis now is being put on that metric part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So why is that? And what are the metrics that you have and you recommend other CMOs to have on their weekly dashboard? What are they reporting on regularly?
Well, so let me start off with, and I don't mean to start off with a negative, but where I think CMOs, and listen, full transparency, I fell into this trap, is when we speak in the language that resonates with us. So we can talk about sort of engagement, impressions, but ultimately, to me, it's got to be distilled down to what the outcome was, what the action taken was. And let's face life today, and you know this, Max, I know that you are monitoring this very closely. We need to look at what did the client or customer actually do as a result of the marketing activity? And then how did that translate either into revenue or better engagement or better awareness? So for me, it's the simple switch from, I think marketeers can get very focused on delivering outputs. And where I think metrics come in is in outcomes, what happened as a result of. So at State Street, we built a marketing dashboard that was able to sort of map the client journey through the 4 stages that I sort of identify as basically awareness, engagement, relationship, and advocacy, and have a score and an outcome for each of those stages. And sometimes you wouldn't have all 4, you might have 1 or 2, but then it's much more aligned to the business and the revenue outcomes.
And is that something that's unique to the business? Because what I find trying to build dashboards is actually other people's dashboards are useless.
Yes, I think that's really true. I think so. My greatest partners in my career are the CFO, not necessarily known as a natural ally of the lesser spotted CMO, and yet I think it's a really critical partnership, but also the head of revenue, the head of sales. And I think together you can determine what are those important outcome metrics that you want to measure. And how do you make sure that a common language is used through the organization? Because if the CMO goes into the boardroom or the management team to present and uses metrics that are native to them but don't resonate beyond the marketing team, I think you've lost your audience. And I think where that particularly comes into play is I think there almost should be a sort of ballad. There's an opening here for song in terms of the ballad of "Give Me My Budget," that marketeers are continually having to make the case for their budgets. And my response to that is you're going to be much better off if that case is embedded in the business value you're bringing, and if you've established that baseline from the get-go, because otherwise it can be way too easily viewed as discretionary spend, and let's cut that.
And when times are hard, I guess the language everyone speaks is revenue.
Yes.
And if you're talking in the business language and business speak during the good times, and you have that embedded as culture within your team during the good times, then it makes those difficult conversations a bit easier.
Yeah, it does. And again, I mean, even as you said, in the difficult times, we all have to figure out how to do more with less. But as you said, Max, it's grounded in the same vocabulary, the same lexicon. And you can determine, again, how you can deliver that value that corresponds to what the overall kind of corporate viewpoint is.
Well, I think this is a wonderful jumping off point because one of the things that I've noticed in the finance industry is that they're terrible at trying to cut through with some kind of human brand, some kind of connection to something bigger than their product. And that's even more amplified when you go to a B2B institution like State Street. But you were really ahead of the curve. You started to borrow some techniques from the consumer world, and one of those was this customer centricity that you're talking about now. And there was a marked change when you led the team at State Street, where the voice shifted from talking about themselves to talking about the customer. Can you walk me through the process of how you did that?
Well, I mean, I wish I could sort of claim some great sort of mastermind, but to me, I mean, you said it really well, Max, that with any business, it starts with the customer. And a big piece of this is also making sure, in the case of State Street, that its 40,000 colleagues understood the role they played in delivering for that customer. Because unless you can make that connectivity, I think it's very, you will often have a gap between what you aspire to be and what you actually deliver. So, within the suite that I had when I was at State Street, that included the employee communications and engagement piece of the puzzle. So I think that's a very important starting point. But the other thing I think you need to do is your point about cut through. I think financial services loves to sort of wrap itself in a layer of complexity. It hasn't met an acronym that it hasn't wanted to rugby tackle to the ground. And that just makes it really difficult for people to relate to, and particularly, as you said, in the B2B context. And then when I became CMO and sort of did an audit of how we were communicating, State Street was founded in 1792. And I think at the time we had something like 30 trillion in assets under custody and administration. So the message we were sending is that we are really old and we're really big. But if I'm a client, I'm not really sure what I get from that. So it was about sort of reframing that language to really focus on what is the client value proposition. It was making the language a lot more simple, sort of banning words like robust would be a good start, using words like pivot.
Synergies.
Synergies. Let's just all agree that synergy is really awful. And then, Max, it was about like articulating why does State Street exist? And it's about creating better outcomes for the world's investors and the people they serve. That's quite simple and straightforward, and everybody can find their connection to that. So for me, it started out with the language, reducing complexity, putting a style guide together, making it easier for people to speak about State Street, to write about State Street, and then also delivering a framework for how we would talk to clients that would start with what is the client challenge that we're trying to solve. And I remember when I became CMO, one of the things I asked for was, could I see an RFP? And literally, like, someone came into my office who looked like a wheelbarrow. And it was sort of, 180-page presentation. And it's just, I get it. I get how this happens. But we've got to be able to simplify. And as you said, we've got to be able to cut through, start with a client challenge, talk about, State Street had 10% of the world's tradable securities. We had incredible insights that we could share and bring to bear against those challenges. Then you can talk about how you solve the challenges. So it was a very simple value proposition framework.
Well, let me just sort of stop you there a second, because it feels like you're slightly underselling how hard this is, because that's 40,000 employees.
Yeah.
In a backdrop of where there's a major global football tournament happening, that's sort of half the size of Wembley Stadium.
Yeah.
There's a
Well
lot
done.
of people. There's a lot of people. And also these people have been doing that for so long. So how come when you start talking to the sales team and the wider team, they listen to you? Like, how did you build that credibility when you say, hey, we need to change this, we need to simplify the language? How did you get them to listen, and how did you get it to turn it into action?
It's a great question, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it was easy. And I think, honestly, Max, it starts with providing sales with insights to help them be more effective. So one of the sort of predicates that I had for the value proposition was conducting primary research into the challenges and issues that our clients view most problematic that we can sort of deliver solutions for. So with that first pillar, I was able to go into the sales and revenue teams and say, these 5 things really matter to asset owners. These 3 things really matter to hedge funds. And so I had the data to back that up. And so from that, I could partner with them to develop a more focused, streamlined approach for go-to-market. But it's little wins every day. And, what I found is, we implemented a system for presentations at State Street using, as part of the marketing stack, using Seismic. And that was all about having one single source of the truth, making it easier, because what we found is when people were going to present to a sovereign wealth fund, they were having to recreate a deck, and that was taking time away from their conversations. If we could make that instant, have a library, have a sort of governing process against that, that again would win me allies and friends. So it was small wins, starting with insights, making life easier. And really, I think sort of success gets success. You know, people feel comfortable with this framework and they get more fluent with it. It becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. But I will say for all your listeners, because I know you've got many fans out there in the marketing world, the fact is that it's like a whack-a-mole game, and you have to be persistent and you have to go back again and again and again to reinforce the framework, because otherwise the 168 pages will creep back.
Was the phrase that you've used with me in the past is that it cannot be a fad diet.
That it absolutely can't. I think that's exactly right. And too often companies pursue these initiatives and they'll give it a name. They'll sometimes even give it a program management office, but then it becomes, as you said, a complete fad diet and people go back to business as usual. It has to become a fabric of the company.
So there's so much already packed in there that we've uncovered. Is, you know, root your insight in data and find the truth. Have empathy. Try and partner with other teams and help them achieve their goals. And all of that will start to snowball as long as you have persistence. Love it.
And I think another P is partnership. I think too often marketing teams, I've seen a marketing team model, Max, and you know, I spent a lot of time watching what was happening in the industry, where the marketing team likes to position itself as an agency within the company. And on the one hand, I get that because you want to be able to attract great creatives, you know, people who feel that they have the sort of headroom they need in order to sort of develop. But you also have to remember that you're in service of the business. And so you have to balance that. You have to build the partnerships and you have to understand the business.
Totally. Now, when it comes to understanding the business and especially on customer insight, one thing I found from speaking to you is that you take NPS and employee NPS incredibly seriously. In fact, we just spent some time today with you in a room of 15, 20 members of staff here, just so you could get the real insights behind what was going into those employee NPS scores. Why do you do that?
So, well, from in my role as a board director, I mean, you know, the board employee engagement is something that's incredibly important. And understanding, as you said, what lies beneath the data and how people feel is something that is part of my responsibility to report back to the broader board. I am a champion of NPS because, Max, it measures advocacy. How likely are you to recommend? And that to me is the gold standard in terms of what you want to achieve with a client or, for that matter, a colleague. And what existed prior to NPS at State Street is we had myriad client surveys. But imagine, Max, if I'm in the studio with you now and I'm asking you directly, so what do you think, Max? What do you think of us? What do you think of our service relationship? Are you really going to sort of tell me what you think to my face? And too many of the surveys were sort of proprietary and discreet and were executed that way. And by developing a net promoter score discipline, I think it enabled two things. One, we were able to have a complete feedback loop. So having the client at, you know, surveying them at kind of key moments in the relationship, finding out how they felt, having the accountable people around that if changes were made, you know, where are they on the scale of, you know, sort of passive advocates all the way down to sort of not so much. And I think it really, that sort of focus, that discipline, and then ultimately tying that, Max, to incentive compensation and overall sort of compensation for the company, I think is really key. And it's a best practice. And as you cited earlier, it came straight out of the consumer world.
Totally. But how do you do it well? Because especially if you're tying it to compensation, the NPS is only powerful when you get the honest feedback. And as soon as it becomes a metric that you're tracking against, you find ways just to bump that number up. So how do you get an organization to actually care about getting genuine feedback so that they can act on?
So, I mean, I think a few things. One is that, the way that you execute the survey is anonymous. So you allow people to really give you that honest feedback. I also think that by tying to compensation, it goes back to your comment about the fad diet. People know that it's hardwired into the fabric of the company because it's not that difficult to get the feedback, but it's another thing entirely to act on that feedback and make sure that the comments that are being received, because there's so much magic in those verbatims, are actively being tracked and acted upon. So I think that it's really having the discipline, being really focused on it, having it, the overall score be less of a metric and more what you're doing about it, and having the focus be on that.
And one of the recent guests that we had on here was one of the engineers on the original iPhone.
Yeah.
And he always talks about, you almost didn't need to do an NPS score because the internal staff, as they were building this product, were using it every day, telling their friends about it, excited to be part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And almost it seemed like a leading indicator of success on anything that they're working on is are the staff bought in and excited and proud to work where they are. Is that something that you've seen?
I've definitely seen it. And I think this ENPS score, the Employee Net Promoter Score, can be a leading indicator in terms of not only overall engagement, but how that translates into overall company performance. Now, I currently serve on a board of a company called Irrational Capital that looks at the link between ENPS and overall engagement and equity performance. And there absolutely is a correlation. Part of the piece that I always say to people is, don't be afraid by having lots of detractors or lots of people who are sort of in that sort of neutral passive bucket, because as marketeers, we should see that as an opportunity to convert and move up the spectrum into advocates. So just having a baseline, having action plans beneath it is really, really critical. But there's opportunities.
And also, one of the exercises I love to do with the NPS score is tie it when you're coming up with brand messaging, when you're coming up with product changes, segmenting that research out by your detractors and promoters, and it gives you an entirely new insight on how you crack new markets.
Yeah, it does. And also, I think the great thing about NPS is, as you just said, you can use it in a transactional sense and you can use it in a macro sense, and then compare that data and look at it, as you said, on a segmentation basis. And that gives you insights into new products and new capabilities. And you should be constantly sort of refreshing that.
Okay, so the NPS score is the CMO's secret tool.
I think so. Secret sauce, definitely.
Secret sauce.
There's one other piece about NPS, because again, that gives you the voice of the client in the organization. And that goes back to one of my 4 success sort of criteria for CMOs.
And it's powerful if you're aspiring to be a marketing leader or a CMO, that owning that and understanding that customer voice than anyone is a very powerful way to get buy-in from the rest of your leadership.
Completely.
So I'd like to switch gear, because we've spoken a lot about, what makes a great CMO, in your opinion. We've spoken about NPS and research and the voice of the customer. I'd like to speak about some specific things that you achieved in your career and some of the story behind that. We have spoken at length about the power of great content and how transformative it can be. But I wanted to zone in a little bit on your partnership with The Economist when you were at State Street. But more interestingly, the troubled path that you had on the way to getting there. Talk to us about that. What problem were you trying to solve? And tell us the story of why you ended up partnering with The Economist.
Sure, Max. So I described, when I became CMO, doing an audit of how we spoke about ourselves, our voice, if you will. So there was a body of work around how do we simplify that story? How do we make it more client-centric? One of the things that clients told us is because you sit in this extraordinary position in the financial services ecosystem, you have insight that we can't get in anywhere else. And so a challenge for me is, how do I translate that into thought leadership? And so I began with trying to build that internally. And what I've found is it's very difficult when you're within a company, within the sort of walls of the company. It's inevitable after a while to almost sort of inhale your own exhaust. And no matter how hard you try, you're always going to revert to this sort of language that is much more inside out than outside in. And so
What do you mean by that? Give us an example of.
Well, I think what it means is that you end up inevitably talking more about yourself than you do either the problem or the issue, or you overly try to kind of make it too salesy, and that doesn't engage people. So having failed, because I learn greatly by mistakes, I described also doing sort of primary research. So we partnered with an offshoot of The Economist called Longitude, who were a group of journalists and researchers who weren't encumbered by our sort of lexicon, our proclivities to sort of talk about ourselves, and could sort of cut through and deliver content that was much more engaging than that which we could deliver in-house. So we started off with segment-specific campaigns. We would call it sort of sector solutions. So we would launch campaigns for asset owners where we would talk about the issues facing asset owners, key themes, write papers, do research. And we saw an extraordinary spike in engagement with the content when we partnered with an external firm, because it was just much more accessible and much more readable. And there was that discipline to it that, again, if you're doing it in-house, you are absolutely going to meander. So I feel that partnership, and there were many others that we subsequently explored, was the best way for us to deliver content. And I'm not talking, by the way, about sort of advertorial, which, is a terrible term unto itself, I feel, and not necessarily what people want to read. I'm talking about really compelling, short, might I add. I think brevity is always our friend. People just do not have the bandwidth to sort of download 60-page treatises. But to have, my mantra was the right content to the right person at the right time. So right content were my partners, right people were my insights and data, and the right time was sort of listening and understanding those points, taking you back to the client fingerprint, knowing when they engaged, how they consumed, and serving it up to them in that preferred format.
I mean, it's crazy to think like the industry still struggles with this. The
Yes.
60-page PDF still exists. It's just, instead of being printed, is being put on LinkedIn. So why is it so hard? And look, not to be too self-serving, at Finimize, we know about creating great content. We know the power of engaging content.
Yeah.
And we're now partnering with more organizations for this exact reason. But why is it so hard to get a tone of voice that comes through everything that they do? Why is it so hard to get creative writers to come into the finance industry and actually deliver work that drives results?
Well, I think there's some sort of practical pieces. I mean, I did in various sort of iterations while I was CMO try to bring people in-house, but inevitably it's kind of like you get sort of sucked into the vortex. And by the time you've been through all of the sort of compliance checks and, it's become a sort of exercise in frustration. So it's not necessarily compelling. I also think we have a terrible habit of we can't get out of our own way. And again, we believe sort of, our own sort of mythology around what's important. And having that objectivity is very important. And, I remember, Max, you and I talking quite early on as Finimize was sort of turning to B2B. I just thought it was the most fantastic idea because it's the biggest challenge I had as CMO. And I think being able to have compelling content is a competitive advantage because it's an engagement point that can be enduring. But I don't know. I think it's a mix of kind of corporate structure. I think it's partly hard wiring. It's partly not having that outside in lens that you inevitably lose when you're sort of internal.
Well, one of the things that I guess I've come across when I speak to on this sort of run of speaking to CMOs, there's a difficult decision around in-house versus
Yeah.
outsource. There's
Yeah.
almost some pride that you can build and hire that team in-house.
Yeah.
How do you think about, when to build in-house, when to outsource?
Yeah, I think again, you're following. So you start off with what are the business objectives and what are the marketing solutions that you could deliver against that business objective? Where do you need to have flexibility and where do you need to have a sort of fixed, sort of constant continuum? So in my world, I felt very strongly about having our in-house creative team and really sort of nurturing that talent in order to be nimble. I had an incredible.
And your creative team is sort of their
designers,
visual copy,
visual language, brand.
Okay. And they're working on ads and decks and
probably less so on ads, more the visual language of the company, everything that would be expressed through the brand. I felt that was something important to have in-house and to have, again, that flexibility.
Rather than because this is alongside the PDF that needs to go into Finance Remote 101 is the stock image of the
Yes.
website.
Oh, can we get rid of that? Yeah. It's absolutely it's mesmerizing. And I don't know where these people come from. It's extraordinary. Yes. So no stock images is another great, you can avoid that. And so in-house creative, PR is something that's obviously incredibly important, the earned media piece to have close. But then we built a network of about 11 or 12 PR agencies globally that help implement that strategy with an overarching global head of PR. But rather than having one agency do everything, where you're going to have sort of inconsistent performance across markets, we could pick and choose who the best people were and really localize the strategy, which is really important if you're a global company.
So those agencies you would split by geography or by different, I guess, skill sets or
generally
knowledge?
By geography, Max, because you want to be, you want people who would have the best relationships with media in, say, Japan, or, Australia or the UK. So generally geography, but sometimes you would also split by capability because there are some agencies that are very good for asset management and then agencies that are very good on a capital markets or corporate front. But then on content, that was increasingly outsourced because you get a better result, as I described. And I think you have more agility and you're able to be more dynamic and you can absolutely flex. And I think, again, competitive intelligence, I kept quite close because, again, it's that piece of keeping, the voice of the client, the data, very much sort of internal. But I think you're constantly asking yourself, should I build it or should I do it? Outsource. And it's interesting because you're right. It is that, continual question that CMOs ask. But I remember visiting a client organization where they very proudly took me through the 4 floors where they had insourced absolutely everything, including their own newsroom. Wow. And I remember thinking, on the one hand, I thought, wow, and I had a little bit of sort of FOMO, but then I thought about it and thought, well, how is that going to work? I mean, because the other thing, Max, that you get from having a balance is that the ideas that you generate externally help your team internally. So I think one of the things that I enjoyed doing the most was bringing all of our partners together once a year to connect as a whole and share ideas, share best practice, share, new ideas and information and insights. So I never wanted people to feel like, oh, we outsource to them, or here, take this. We're all one team working against common objectives.
I'd like to move on to another partnership that was
Yes.
wildly successful for you. And I think it really captures the essence of you as a CMO, like you're rooted in the customer insight, not accepting mediocrity when it comes to the creative and bringing that through into the design, copy, tone, and being horizontal across the whole organization. I love all of that. But this partnership that you launched with TED has sort of really struck me as quite unique for the time. So talk to us about that TED Talk moment that you had at State Street and how it came about and what the outcome was.
Yes. So when I started as CMO of State Street, there was a preponderance, and it wasn't unique to State Street, but I think there was a lot of golf sponsorships and sporting sponsorships, which, okay, I get it. It makes sense. Client entertainment. But increasingly, by the way, clients can't accept entertainment of that ilk. And it's very difficult to sort of activate sponsorships like that. The other piece, Max, was that increasingly we're living in a digital surround sound world. And those types of sponsorships, although they may be very important locally, for example, we were a big partner of the Red Sox. That was a very valued sponsorship for all of our fabulous colleagues in Boston and Massachusetts. We needed to be able to broaden the platform globally. And then the third piece is sponsorship should be beneficial both internally and externally. And so what could our colleagues get out of our partnerships? And fourth, you mentioned earlier the challenges that financial services brands have cutting through. How do you humanize something like State Street? So TED was something that I had been a long-time fan of. I would sort of inhale TED Talks, and I would just love it. It was so refreshing to me. And this idea that you weren't sort of, standing up against a PowerPoint deck, which I think is like, honestly, the kiss of death. I loved that.
This
freedom.
was early on as well in Ted's sort of career, right?
Yeah, it was very early on. In fact, Max, we were the first ever corporate sponsor. And now, TED actually is a much more sort of commercial oriented organization. But back then it was very much about storytelling. And I'm not going to get all scientific on you, but it is a scientific fact that our brains are wired for stories, not facts. So for me, the partnership with TED was about bringing our colleagues at State Street on stage to tell stories about their lives. It wasn't to talk about custody. It wasn't to talk about asset management. It was to tell breakthrough stories about everything from, there was one talk about stage fright, which actually was a colleague of mine in the marketing team whose talk got more views than Bono at U2, because he talked about something that was really relatable. I hate getting on stage, and he made a song about it.
That's incredible.
We had another colleague who came out on the TED stage, because we did it live, Max, in both London and Boston. So we had the full TED set up, but then obviously all of the talks were housed on TED.com. And a colleague who for the first time came out on stage and said, I'm gay. And it was extraordinary, like that psychological safety and feeling of connectivity and pride. So it was definitely, I view it as an absolute career highlight for me. But just to be able to tell a story about a company through its people, as opposed to a litany of statistics about who we are, what we do.
And to bring you back to some of sort of your earlier points around what makes a great CMO, where did that start from a business perspective? What were you trying to do from a business perspective? And then what were the outcomes that showed you that was a success?
So I think from a business perspective, it was, how do we demonstrate a different side to State Street, a more sort of human side? We measured the client traction and impact. So for every TED at State Street we did, we had clear client metrics around client attendance, client engagement, follow-up, and then we would track those relationships to see whether or not there was an uplift or any change. I mean, to some degree, TED was as close as we would get to a sort of brand partnership at the time. So we were also looking for sort of brand penetration and cut through, which was incredibly effective because of the sort of distribution that the TED platform gets. And then also looking at the internal reaction, Max, which was a great degree of pride. I mean, we had people, you had to sort of submit your idea and a videotape to be considered. We didn't do it. TED did it directly to curate the content to get the best. And it was hugely competitive.
That's incredible because, I mean, I've worked in finance for 10 years. I think finance companies are great, but how are you going to go organically viral like that with content created by your staff?
And I mean, we had more than 3.5 million views of TED Talks by State Street colleagues. And what I love today, Max, is I see those talks pop up everywhere on their LinkedIn profiles, on their overall sort of social media profiles. The pride and exposure that it's given the team, I think, is tremendous.
And comes back to driving that employee advocacy.
Yes.
One of the things that I noticed, because I've spoken to I've had a few examples of just these incredible partnerships, and you start to realize that one of the skills in a great CMO is just sort of being aware and noticing and get to what's going on in the world around you so that you get that timing right. Because like you said, it'd be very different if you did that today. And you were the first. There was something special about doing it right then. And the world needed something that was a bit more authentic.
Yeah, I think the authenticity point is a really good one, Max. And I mean, it wasn't that I had a crystal ball, but I do think that CMOs need to pay attention to what's happening outside there in the broader world and really sort of tune into the zeitgeist, for lack of a better term. And, you have to be careful. It can't be, I've always loved this, ergo we should sponsor it. You then have to figure out what the business outcome is, the employee outcome, as we discussed. But I think it can be, you can capture those moments that really cut through and make a difference and are enduring.
And it can't happen, every single quarter that you go after something. But
No.
There were other moments where you did something similar in your career. I think, State Street's Fearless Girl is one of the most impactful campaigns in the history of banking. Can you talk me through how that kind of came about and why you think it resonated how it did at the time and what you think the impact was for State Street?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that how it came about was really the credit goes to the State Street CEO, Ron O'Hanley, who has, long been passionate about diversity and gender equity. And as he transitioned from CEO of State Street Global Advisors to State Street, through a lens of having meaningful engagement from a stewardship perspective with the companies in which global advisors were investing, and seeing that only 70% of Russell 3000 companies had just one woman on their board. And I think everybody knows that greater gender balance creates better outcomes for all of the stakeholders. So I think this idea of taking on a campaign and really going after that issue, credit absolutely goes to Ron. I think then the sort of execution of that is a mix of fabulous Stephen Tisdale, who was at the helm of Global Advisors marketing at the time, but also a team that really sort of tapped into the feeling and the mood around the time, which was post the election where Trump was in. There was a backdrop of Me Too. There was this feeling that, women didn't have a voice. And by making a statement of putting a girl arms akimbo opposite the bull on Wall Street, were just, I think at the time when we did it, we had no idea the impact that it would have. But the reason I feel it worked, Max, was that it was rooted in a real platform. It wasn't just for likes and to go viral. There was real action being
Well,
driven underneath it.
there was a ETF launched around it, which is another great example of going
Yep.
beyond surface level and incremental change. It's like, how do we
Yeah,
adapt our product?
exactly. The ticker symbol, the SHE ETF was part of it. But I will say that, you can cynically say, well, you just put her there to promote a product. But it wasn't that. It was actually to drive meaningful change. And the stewardship agenda at Global Advisors was really sort of laser focused on driving that change. And since the campaign, that 71% of companies have become 99% of Russell 3000 companies have at least one woman. And the number of women on boards has moved the needle in an exponential way, I think, because of the campaign. But it also got the zeitgeist. I mean, I remember people got tattoos of Fearless Girl.
That's amazing.
Which was just, I mean, it was incredible. And I think there was something really emotional about it.
Well, there was also controversy and some backlash at the time around exactly what you mentioned. As as now a female board member of a public company, and at the time one of the only females in leadership in banking, that must have been hard.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And I mean, I think the backlash inevitably sort of spanned, the gamut. In fact, the person who put the bull on Wall Street didn't like it at all. And there was a big sort of fight. And I thought, well, bring it. This is the story of our lives. Everybody wants to sort of move us into a corner. So actually, we did move her to the front of the stock exchange. So she got an even better spot. So that didn't work. But I think in general, you have to sort of focus in on how, like, things have to change and we have to drive change. Each one of us has a responsibility to pay it forward and help others. And I think you're always going to get flack. You're always going to get, I mean, I remember it got quite political with some of the sort of politicians on the right really trying to make a stink about it. And you just have to have the courage of your convictions.
And also, as a CMO, how do you get no offense to State Street, but a boring B2B institutional asset manager in the zeitgeist conversation multiple times? It's exactly what the role of the CMO is there for when it comes to driving business value.
And to have longevity. I mean, we brought Fearless Girl to London. We brought her to Japan. And the greatest thing is to see the young, the little girls, little boys, fathers, mothers, everybody having their picture taken, being a part of it. And I think all of us need to be a little bit more fearless.
I love that. And
I wouldn't say we're boring, Max, really. It's fascinating.
It's my job to provoke in these interviews.
Yeah, no, it's good.
So I'd like to sort of, as we bring this to an end, one of the things that is also fascinating is your transition from CMO to board member.
Yeah.
How is it different from being an exceptional CMO to being an exceptional board member?
Well, I'm working on being an exceptional board member. So I think, it's very much a journey. But I will say for the CMOs that I know will be listening to this, I certainly found when I started my board journey that the lore was that CMOs are not yet really in the boardroom or not as much in demand as a former CEO or former CFO, even like a former legal counsel. And I thought, well, there's a trend that I definitely want to buck. But also, I feel very strongly that having the voice of the client on the board is something that is valuable. Having an understanding of brand value, client experience, employee experience is very valuable. But I think in order to make the transition successfully, it's sort of like we talked about in terms of what are the criteria that can help define successful CMOs. I think you have to realize that you're not one note and you need to be fluent in the business and particularly in the governance and the regulatory piece when you transition onto a board. So I think.
And how do you get fluent? Because it's easy in hindsight with these things, but that transition point is quite tough.
So here's the advice that I give people, particularly CMOs. If you want to serve on a board, there's nothing better than starting when you're in your current role. You can start out slowly, join a nonprofit board, get some experience, get used to the lexicon, get used to the framework. That's number one. I think number two, certainly if you're in financial services and you're CMO, you need to be fluent in the regulatory environment because it underpins the entire industry. So I think that's less of a learning curve. And then I think it's about asking questions, really paying close attention, going on the journey to learn. And I think, good boards certainly enable the onboarding process is something that can really help you there. And then I think it's knowing the delineation. You are no longer an operating executive. You are there to provide oversight, to ask good questions, to listen really well, to help frame and develop the strategy. But ultimately, the implementation now belongs to others. I will say, Max, that one thing that I certainly feel passionate about is also being an advocate for marketeers on the board and perhaps, being someone that appreciates the seat that they're in and can help, sort of be that advocate, be that sounding board. But I absolutely think because marketeers see things on the horizontal axis, I think CMOs can make great CEOs, and I think they can be great additions to boards.
Well, what a fantastic place to end. And as we come to a close, for all of those CMOs listening and potentially aspiring CMOs, I ask all of my guests, what is the one piece of advice that you could give someone that could practically be the game changer in their career?
I think don't be afraid to fail is a big piece. I think I've learned from my mistakes. So don't be afraid to fail and always be open to new ideas. When you become a CMO, you will have to realize that the best ideas are probably not going to come from you, and you need to be open to that.
Wonderful. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your time in London with us.
I will, Max. Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight.